Right, evening everybody. Yeah, so Claire asked me if I'd just do this. This is obviously part of the kind of, if you like, the practical process of when it comes to property. There's obviously a lot of people in the group who are kind of seasoned professionals, which probably know a lot of this stuff. But equally, there's a lot of people here that are just starting out or haven't been going for too long, and hopefully some of this will be helpful and we'll kind of give you something to think about, really give you some tips and tricks, as Claire says. So we're obviously on a bit of a time limit. I'm conscious there's lots of us on tonight, so I'll rattle through this. This is obviously, you could go on forever with a lot of this stuff, so a lot of it I'll just be kind of scratching the surface on, but we'll get into it, and obviously I'm in the breakout room later if you want to go into it in any more detail. So property viewings, so certain questions around that. How do you do them? What's your method? What do you need to take? And that's the kind of stuff that I get asked quite a lot. I see it in groups on Facebook, etc. And I kind of get asked it directly with new people coming into it, just trying to kind of work out, how to kind of streamline and simplify the process, I guess, more than anything else. I think a lot of people, when they start out, certainly when they're new into property, they just kind of get washed along. They arrange a viewing, they go in. Typically your agents are going to be kind of spending 5-10 minutes with you on a viewing, which obviously the way the market is at the moment, it's a little bit of a strange one because it's hard to get around that. But generally speaking, before the madness started, I'd always say to people, it's different if you're going out and doing a viewing for your own house. It's a very emotional purchase. I don't know what the stats are, but it's something like within the first 30 seconds, you've decided whether you want to buy the house or not. You're not looking at problems necessarily. You kind of go in, you decide if you want the house, and then you obviously worry about it further down the line with the survey. Obviously with us, we need to take a more kind of measured and a balanced approach with it. So, for us, you need to be able to go in, look at everything that needs doing to that property, work out your kind of estimated refurbishment costs, and then obviously be able to go in fairly quickly with an offer. So we have to kind of approach it in a slightly different way. And for me, there's a lot of kit that you need. Now, when I say you haven't obviously got to have all of this stuff, but this is all the stuff that I take with me. And there's a purpose for all of it. Yes, I admit that sometimes it seems to be a lot of stuff to take around a viewing, but as I say, there's a purpose for all of it and a reason that you need all of it. What I'll do is I'll skip through this fairly quickly. I did a video which I posted on YouTube a while back, which is kind of a bit of a deep dive into all of these things. So what I'll do in a little while, I'll stick a link up to that. If you want to go and have a look at that in more detail, then obviously feel free. But as I say, I'll go through it very quickly now. Obviously, you need a clipboard and pen to record all the data. Laser measure, normal standard old school tape measure, damp meter. You mentioned there, Claire. It's really damp meters you can pick up pretty inexpensively nowadays, and it's definitely one of those things it's worth having. Collapsible ladder, and this is the thing that most people kind of suck their teeth when I say it, because it's obviously a big bit of kit to lug about. But in my opinion, a lot of issues going to start at the top of the house. So you want, if there's a loft there, you want to be getting up in that loft and making sure you can have a look around and see what's going on up there. A torch. Some people say, that I will just use my torch on my camera, but in my experience, that's not good enough. It's not powerful enough, and you can't take photos and videos while you're using that. So I always take a little torch with me as well. Pair of long nose pliers, crowbar, and a pair of gloves. Obviously, the crowbar you want, because obviously if you're in a bit of a dodgy area, it's always handy to be tooled up, isn't it? So it's just always something that's good to have in the back of the car. And obviously binoculars, again, you could argue you don't need binoculars now because the cameras on phones are so good, but I just think they're handy. If you've got a little pair, they're handy to have just to kind of check out roofs and check out if there's long overgrown gardens or whatever. You can just you can make use of them. FAQs. So again, a lot of the questions I get is how do you record the data? And people love this question, don't they? Regardless of whether it's about viewings or anything else, is what's the best way of doing it? And my personal opinion is that there's no hard and fast best way. It's whatever works for you, because everyone's different at the end of the day, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. People talk about lists and, should I have a checklist? And again, I think it comes down to what works for the individual. So when I first started out, I used to go in with a list. People here that have done property training probably will have been given a list by the training provider. I got given one in as I say 4 years ago that I was sort of using, and I went through it and tweaked it, and kind of evolved it. And that's what my one looks like. But to be fair, I don't use it that often anymore, because I'm more of a visual person. And what I used to find is that when I was going in to do a viewing, especially if you're on your own, you might get half an hour with the agent, which is always what I used to ask for. And what, as I say, it's a little bit more difficult now because they're a bit more, they've got more viewings to pack in and they're a little bit less flexible. But in a better market, I'd always say I want a minimum of 30 minutes in there to get everything done that I need to get done. But even with that amount of time, if you're in with an agent, you want to be speaking to the agent, picking their brains, trying to find out about the vendor, get a bit of history from the property. You're also trying to do your survey, your viewing as well, and you're lugging all your gear about. I used to find, again, this is a personal thing, that I used to find it difficult to complete the list in order. I find I was jumping about it a lot, and I used to finish up sitting in the car at the end of the viewing for 10 minutes going through filling out my list. So for me, a few years ago, I was working with a mentor, and he suggested this. This is what he used, and I've kind of adopted it. And it's obviously, as you'll see from that, it's not rocket science, but it's something that I think maybe people haven't thought of, but it's really helpful if you are a visual person. So what I do is I have it's just a simple template, simple rectangular boxes sitting around the outside of it. Before I go and do the viewing, I then take a screenshot of the floor plan off of the portal, so whether it's Rightmove or Zoopla, whoever it is you're using, drop that into the middle, and then once you're actually in the property, you just walk around and populate everything as you're walking around. So this is one that I did a couple of years ago, and I can still now, if I look at this bit of paper, I can still 100% visualize walking through that property. I know I can remember where everything was, what everything looked like. And it just tends to sink in a little bit more. But as I say, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong. If you're a list person, stick with the list. If you're not, then go with something like this. But I think it's very important to have that kind of process and structure to record the data, rather than trying to either remember it or just kind of jot it down on the back of a fag packet. What I also have is, with my clipboard, I've also got a 4-color Bic pen. So when I'm recording all the data, I'm using either blue or black to for the text, and then I use green for my drainage. So I always record where my SVP is, my soil vent pipes, manhole covers, all that kind of stuff, so that you can identify. Obviously, if you're looking at doing stuff like extensions, if you're looking at doing HMO conversions, if you're looking at kind of adding in en suites or moving bathrooms and things like that, you want to know where your main services are. So it's just it's a good way of recording that, whereas on a list, it's you could make a note of where it is, but it's not as visual. And as I say, jot down exactly where the boilers are, check where the boiler is, and obviously you're going to be looking at age of boiler and all that kind of stuff, where your electrics are, what type of distribution board is it, is it an old style, is it fairly new, all the kind of standard stuff you want to be looking for. I make note there of, if there's any asbestos anywhere, or any kind of Artex, all that kind of stuff, which we'll come on to more in a minute, which is more about the defects. But yeah, that's my kind of method of doing it. As far as the actual process for doing the viewing is, I'm a big fan of start with the end in mind. So work out what's your exit. So before you even go to the viewing, have a good idea in your mind, is it going to be a single let? Is it going to be a high-end flip, or an SA? Is it going to be, are you going to be doing an HMO conversion? Whatever it might be, because often, dependent on what your exit strategy is going to be, will determine how much work you're going to need to do. For example, if you're, depending on where your market is, if you're doing a standard kind of single let, you might be able to get away with just giving it a bit of a, you know, for want of a better phrase, a bit of a tosh over. Whereas obviously if you're looking at you know, full renovation for a flip, you know, a lot of stuff I look at is going to be flips down in the southeast, because, you know, buy-to-lets tend not to work so well. It's going to be, you know, everything's going to be coming out, and it's going to be a real kind of, not necessarily back to brick, but a real proper renovation. So have your set process when you go in. So for me, again, this is not hard and fast, but what I find works for me is I tend to work from top to bottom. So I'll turn up at the beginning, you know, obviously at the viewing. I'll always get there a little bit early, go and stand on the other side of the road, have a look up and down the street. I normally take, you know, I take plenty of photos and videos whenever I go and do a viewing. Look up and down the street, take a photo either way, so you can kind of gauge one, what kind of street it is. You know, you can look at the cars, all that kind of stuff. You know, is it a you know, a fairly affluent area, or is it a, you know, more of a kind of a rundown area? The other reason I do that is for further down the line, once you get to the point where you're going to be starting putting specifications together, if you're doing refurbs on it, you want to be checking stuff like access and parking and all that kind of stuff. So it's good to get a good record and overview of the street scene. And then what I do is I just obviously look at the front of the property, make sure you record and understand what's going on at the front of the house. So is there a front garden? Are there gates, fences, walls, hedges? Is there a driveway, path? You know, whatever it might be, make sure you understand, is there a cost, or is there going to be a cost associated with that in the refurb? Because I think that's something that people sometimes miss. They go racing into the property and suddenly forget, you know, when they do their numbers at the end, they've missed out 3, 4, 5 grand to do the front garden. And then I basically scan down from the top of the building. So look at the, you know, start with stuff like the chimney. Does it need repointing? Does it need flashing? You know, look at the roof. What's the ridge line of the roof like? Is it nice and straight? Are there any tiles missing? And then just scan your way down. So look at you know, gutters, soffits, fascias, all that kind of stuff. And then just scan down the building. You know, obviously checking for stuff like cracks and damp and all that kind of stuff, which I'll come on to very briefly in a minute. And then just kind of work your way around the building. Obviously, if it's a terrace house, that's quite straightforward. Just doing the front, and then you're going in. Obviously, if it's a semi or an end of terrace, then just work your way around, or detached, work your way around the sides and do the same process. Once you're inside, obviously you're going to be going through room by room. And for me, again, this is kind of depends on what your exit is, I guess. But for me, I know that most of the stuff I'm going to look at is going to be pretty run down. It's going to need a proper refurb, which I'll suspect most of us are going to be looking at. You know, there's probably not many of us that are going to be looking at places that don't need any work doing. But for me, you know, I know that I'm going to be doing flips, so I know, and they've got to be fairly high end. So I know that we're going to be taking out the kitchen, we're going to be putting in a new bathroom, we're going to be doing the flooring, we're going to be probably taking all the woodwork off and replacing the doors. So for me, that's all a bit of a given. So I try to focus, and this is especially important if you're up against it with time on the viewing, is focus on the big ticket defects. And what I mean by that is stuff like damp. So, you know, it could be rising damp, could be penetration damp, could just be a case that there's really bad ventilation in the house. You know, ventilation could be like blocked up or papered over, I've seen recently. Things like structural issues, trees, plants, Japanese knotweed, all that kind of stuff. Just kind of get an idea of that, make sure you're aware of all that sort of stuff. Your general remediation problems, in particular, asbestos, potential asbestos. And then something, again, I think which some people tend to kind of overlook and miss out on is pest problems. So again, when you're scanning and looking at your guttering and your fascias and soffits, are you seeing any birds going in and out? I've seen that on quite a few places I've been to. You know, pigeons are flying in and out, or you can see that something's gnawed a hole in the fascia. And again, it's all of this stuff is about recording the information, because information is power. And then once you come to further down the line, when you're looking at putting together your estimating costs, and then further on from that, when you're putting the spec together for your builder, if you can tell them and give them as much information on all this as possible, then it just sets you up. So moving on to damp, I'll go through this really quickly, but you know, this is just a nice little graphic to tell you just some of the places where you could find damp and things to look out for. So again, you know, as I say, starting at the top, I mean, it doesn't say it on there, but, look around the chimney. Does it need pointing? Does it, is the lead flashing missing or cracked or lifting, because you're going to get moisture going down there. You've got to remember that obviously the roof is your property covering. So if there's any problems up there, then that's going to be one of your sources of issues going forward, which is why it's so important to have a ladder and, get yourself up in the loft and have a good look. Are there blocked gutters? If there's vegetation in the guttering, that's always a kind of a bit of a telltale sign, or slipped tiles, anything like that, which could be causing the gutters to overflow, which is going to then run down the brickwork, which could potentially cause a bit of penetration damp. Stuff around the windows, again, check especially when you're outside and when you do your scan of the building. When you get to the bottom, check all your drainage. Are there any puddles? Is there pooling of water there? Because that could obviously indicate you've got problems with your drainage, and then that could obviously cause rising damp as well. So there's a lot of things to kind of look out for. A lot of the real obvious things, are fairly obvious when you're doing the viewing. If the front of the house is soaking wet in a certain area, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. But again, it's all just stuff to be aware of. Onto stuff like structural. I mean, I would say, I'm not a structural expert, but things you want to be looking out for are, obvious cracks in the building. When you're inside and it's small kind of hairline cracks, then that's normally not too much to worry about. That's could just be shrinkage or something. But certainly if the cracks are kind of thickness of a pound coin or bigger, then you want to, or even sort of 10p coin or bigger, you want to be kind of worrying about it, or certainly investigating it in a bit more detail. If you've got major cracking on the outside, then that's something that needs to be flagged up, and you need to get an expert round. In the first instance, if you've got a good relationship with a builder, get them around to have a look, somebody who's experienced. But ultimately you want to be getting a structural engineer around to look at it if it looks like it's going to be subsidence or something equally as serious. Things to look out for when you're doing your viewing is sinking and sloping floors. Again, these are not all definitive, but they're just good indicators of it might be cool. There might be something going on underneath the surface. Cracks in walls, paths and driveways. Windows and doors sticking is a good one, which is why I always say when you go around doing your viewing, try and open all the windows and doors if you can. If you've got windows that are sticking, especially older kind of timber windows, then that could be an indicator that the wall's shifting, and it's obviously causing the frames to shift a bit. Skirting boards separating from the wall is another possible indicator. Again, it doesn't mean that if your skirting boards are coming off the wall, doesn't necessarily mean that you've got subsidence. It could just mean that they weren't fitted properly to begin with, but something to look out for. And formations of puddles and just pooling of water around the perimeter of the building, because again, that could be issues with drainage, which means you've got surface water, which then could be obviously affecting the quality and the structure of the earth around, which then could lead to subsidence ultimately. So again, it's not something to run a mile from. And a lot of this stuff where, even if you have got subsidence, it's not necessarily the end of the world, because some people will run a mile from it. Some of it can be dealt with fairly inexpensively and fairly easily, as long as you've got the experts on board and you're taking the right advice from the right people. But I see loads of people putting stuff like this and questions on Facebook groups, and it's dangerous to take advice from people really that are just working off of a picture. You need to get somebody out who knows what they're doing. Stuff like Japanese knotweed, again, it's quite common. I've been lucky; I've never come across it in anything that I've looked at, but I know plenty of people that have. Again, it's nothing to be scared of. It needs a proper treatment plan put in place, which needs to be carried out by a certified company. But as long as that's done, generally speaking, again, it's a bit of a generalisation, but generally speaking, there's no issues with that if it's all in place and documented. And also, don't overlook that you might be eligible for land remediation relief on it. In which case, you could get 150% tax relief by removing that. So not only do you get your costs covered, you get an additional 50% in tax relief. In obviously further down the line in your off your corporation tax. Now, obviously, that is the caveat with that is, you need to be a limited company. We need to, you need to be a business buying this property. So, if you're buying it in your own name, then that's not going to be applicable. But again, speak to the experts, speak to people who know what they're doing from the removal point of view, and speak to your accountant or your tax advisor on the relief. And then finally, really on the defect side is asbestos, and I think again a lot of people miss this stuff, and or maybe just don't understand it or don't take it as seriously as they should do. It can be in the right house or the wrong house, whichever way you look at it. It can be everywhere. I mean, that image there obviously just shows in a worst case scenario where it could be. I mean, asbestos was obviously widely used, especially kind of 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and I see it everywhere. You on outbuildings, you see asbestos, cement, corrugated roofing, guttering, downpipes, quite a lot internally. Obviously, stuff like Artex we all know and love. It doesn't always contain it, but sometimes it does. Morley floor tiles is another one. As you'll see there in the bottom right hand corner, they're quite common. I see a lot of those in properties that I go and view, and like with all asbestos, it's not so dangerous if you don't disturb it. But the minute you start, scraping up them tiles and it starts breaking and you start releasing those particles into the air, that's when it gets nasty. There's also asbestos quite often in stuff like insulation, like insulating board, cladding, pipe lagging, all that kind of stuff. There's, if you look at commercial premises, it can be everywhere. And the answer to this really is to kind of have a bit of a good understanding on what can contain it. So when you're walking around doing your viewing, you can document it and take a note. But it's a legal requirement that before you start a refurb on any property, you should be having an R&D, what they call an R&D survey, so refurbishment and demolition survey done, which is basically an Artex survey, an asbestos survey. So a surveyor will come around. It's quite intrusive, so they'll go and they'll take samples from different areas, from walls and ceilings and so on and so forth. It will get sent off to a lab. They'll bring it back, and then they'll tell you whether there's asbestos there and what the methods are to remove that. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. As I say, I'm conscious I only had 20 minutes to do this, so there's a lot to cram in. It's like a lot of this stuff, I could talk. Well, I do. This is one of the sections on the training that I do, and we talk probably for well over an hour on all this stuff normally. You can do quite deep dives into it. But all I would say, especially on the asbestos side, if anybody's doing viewings with a view to obviously doing refurbs, I would very much recommend that you do an asbestos awareness course. You can do it online. It's about 20 quid, 15, 20 quid. It's about a three hour course, and it just gives you a proper good insight into what it is, the damage it can cause, how harmful it is, and just the things you need to be aware of. So it's just for 20 quid and a few hours of your time, it's well worth doing. But other than that, that's me for tonight. As I say, I'm in the breakout room later. If you want to, if you want to do more of a deep dive into all this viewing stuff and general practical property stuff, then my website address is there. Go on there. That will take you straight through to a page to book a call with me. Obviously, jump on and we can have a chat through it all. As I say, you'll see me in the breakout room afterwards. And I'll stick a link in the chat about the for the YouTube video about the equipment for viewings. So I hope that was all right. That's 23 minutes. Not too bad.
That was brilliant. Thank you. Really helpful. Really, really helpful. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I've learned more about viewing property in 23 minutes than I've known, and I'm 51. Darren, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Probably went a bit fast, but as I say, you can catch up with me if you need to.
No, and that point you made about the asbestos, like even when we originally bought our house that we live in now, we did all the surveys that you needed to do, and unfortunately, asbestos was found in the bay areas because they used to clad the interior or Artex the interior with asbestos for insulation. Yeah, and obviously we probably stretched ourselves to the nth degree anyway on what we could go on for this house, because this is supposed to be our forever home, and it ended up coming in at about an extra 4.5-5 grand. So it is, and it obviously it's something that a real skilled environmental disposal company would have to do. And invariably we had to go back to brick in every room of the whole house. So then that just uplifted a load more problems. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, when you get into the asbestos stuff, I mean, that's kind of like the next, you know, when I do my training, that's like the next part is obviously that comes under the estimating side, because you need to start working out costings and all the rest of it, which obviously isn't easy to do when you're, you know, at the viewing stage with stuff like asbestos, because that's a problem. You can't, you know, reasonably, you can't have the R&D survey done until you've at least exchanged, because, you know, vendors are not going to want you going in there. You know, you're not going to want to lob out 300, 400, 500 quid on a survey, and secondly, they're not going to want you going in there. So, yeah, it is a bit of a difficult one to gauge. But
the fortunate part of that was we were able to negotiate, because we were still in negotiation, and obviously we hadn't completed. We were able to negotiate the price down based on what that remediation cost would have come through at. So we ended up getting a little bit. Well, we ended up getting the cost of the asbestos removal taken off the price, which was good for us. But if we were at an exchange point, then we would have been stumped for an extra 5k.
yeah, exactly. All right, lovely. Cheers, guys.
As a bit of a joke,